to be one of the digital presentations of the Greek Primary Teachers Federations against the laws on assessments. It is the fifth central action, and it has to do with axis or pillar 1, special education schools. And it is a great honor to have with us Professor James Kaufman of Educational Psychology at the University of Virginia, author, Dimitris Anastasiou, Greek from the United States at the University of Southern Illinois, and our moderator, a specialist in special education, Mr. Lolitsas. Despite the adverse events, he is here with us. I will give the floor directly to Mr. Lolitsas, who will say a few words about how we will moderate the discussion. The experience hopefully will be equally interested with the previous ones. We would like to thank all the guests for the honor to be here with us. Thank you, President of the Greek Primary Teachers Federation. Allow me to say that after 30+ years of experience with special education, first line as a first-line specialist, I see that there is an improvement in the way we see and deal with special education issues. But new questions are raised that are challenging or provocative, to put it this way, and new pathways that might seem attractive, but we need to be critical vis-à-vis them, even though we hear and are presented as extremely attractive. In the postgraduate studies where I teach, you ask 50 students, professors know that well, 50 students to tell you, what do you think inclusion is, what special education is? You get 30 different answers. Each and every one of them interprets this notion differently. I don't talk about the words like disability and others that are also vague, but we need to analyze all these notions in depth, and understand that we are all on the same page when we tackle these issues. So we need to see that it is a multi-dimensional phenomenon, and we see that we need to see its real dimensions. I hope that our guests will clarify things and analyze them in order to have a better picture on these issues, and especially Mr. Anastasiou, with whom we have worked together in the past, And I think that I know that he has done excellent work. And Mr. Kaufman, who has produced innovative work on that. They are both authors of various books and papers. We will start with Mr. Anastasiou, his presentation, and then with Professor Kaufman, and we will continue with the questions sent by our colleagues. So, Mr. Anastasiou, you've got the floor. Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone from Illinois. We have 8 hours difference with Greece, and I would like to thank for the invitation the Greek Primary Teachers Federation Board, Mr. Kikinis, the president, the President of Educational Studies, Mr. Lolitsas, who will be the moderator of this discussion. I feel a great honor, and I feel rather moved because we are tackling an issue of paramount importance to teachers and parents. I was a member of associations while in federation, and I've been a teacher in special education for 16 to 17 years, and I had the opportunity to serve the interdisciplinary board of Athens. I feel familiarity because my approach is an approach that takes into consideration social needs that you are experiencing on a daily basis at school, and I understand your fight for a public quality school. In order to understand the multidimensional reality and the different aspects Mr. Lolitsas talked about, is to try to change it in a way. And I refer to teaching and learning, because teaching and learning means difference, and students with disabilities are not the exception to that. One approach of learning needs in the wider meaning of the term does not start with a doctrine or a vague human right of a great idea that says that it has the solution for all issues of children or adolescents with disabilities. It is a great honor and pleasure to be in the same panel with James Kaufman, one of the most respected personalities in special education in the United States, with a global influence, a long background, deep knowledge of the issue and the evolution of special education, a person with a sense of justice, and co-author in 20 more papers with whom we've been exchanging points of view in the last 14 or to 16 years since we've met. I would like to share some slides on my screen. It should be that. Well, this is the layout. I don't know if I will be able to cover everything because we have agreed that I will just speak for 40 minutes and then we will have Mr. Kaufman with his own presentation. I will say a few words about the background and socio-political framework of special education. The crossroads at which we are at present, the relationship with inclusion, the inclusion practices, some international full inclusion models from Portugal and Italy, especially in Italy, that they've been introducing full inclusion since 1999. We will talk about culture and systemic change and how that could be achieved, problems arising during this change, a couple of words between special education and social justice, their relationship, and the trends concerning special education on evidence-based practices with regard to the background and socio-political framework. I will start with 1975 when we had the important law, the American Law on Special Education, Education for All Handicapped Children Act, that coincided with the end of 30 golden years of welfare state until from 1945 to 1975 with financial growth plus 4% of GDP. It was one of the last laws and the culmination of the welfare state. The main principle of the idea model is the right for free, appropriate public education. Even though the responsibility for education belongs to states, the responsibility for special education belongs to the federation, to the government of the United States. I won't get into details with regard to the principles of the Act, but I need to underline, nevertheless, that after 1975, we had an abundance of developments in special education in the universities of the United States with funds for research and new posts. We have the Mary Warner report, 1978, and the new Act of 1981 during the government of Margaret Thatcher. In Greece, we have the first law on special education of 1981. In 1986, a revision, it was revised. A milestone law of 2000 for the education of people with special educational needs, and the present law 3619 for special education and the education of people with disabilities or special educational needs. And I will try to analyze that later on. During this background, the developments of special education were a top-down approach, respecting the changes in culture, and there was a problem-solving process. What was before, during the 70s and 80s, we had charities. A lot of children which did not receive these special education services. We had some special schools alone under the supervision of private initiatives and the church. During the 70s, we have the state branch, and these services are part of the welfare state. At the same time, we have special school and special classes that are inclusion classes per se, which is a soft form of resource rooms. So we start in Greece to having a continuation of frameworks. Here you see a comparison between the educational frameworks in Greece and the United States. We have the general education class only. Then we have co-teaching in Greece. We call it in Greece parallel support. Nevertheless, it is not exactly co-teaching the way it is done in the United States. It takes place in a different way. We have the inclusion classes that are a soft translation or depiction of resource room. We have this soft version of the United States resource room. We don't have self-contained special classes in Greece. And of course, we have special schools, special day school, and home education, residential, homebound or hospital instruction. Of course, this framework was not built within a day, but after a process of decades. In the United States, in order to have a comparison, based on the data of 2019-2018, referring to 2018, 12% of the school education, 6.5 million teachers out of 12 million, from kindergarten to the age of 21, from kindergarten until the 12th grade, were recipients of special educational services. From those students, 8% of them were in inclusion frameworks, with an asterisk that what is considered inclusive framework in the United States is that the student spends 80% of his or her time in general classes. It does not exclude an education for 6 hours out of 30 in order to depict the Greek reality outside the Greek general classes, and 4% receives education outside the general classes. There is the issue of correspondence of structures. Since there is no correspondence between the Greek class, the inclusion class, and the American resource rooms, and there is no correspondence between parallel support or this soft version of the American RR. So the conclusions are purely wrong. From the European Office for special needs and inclusive education, we know for Greece that these are the data for Greece. For 2016, 2017 are the most recent ones. 0.95% of students in Greece were in special schools. In the United States, we had 0.6% of students, but if I go back to my slide, there was 1.6 of students in special classes that are not in the same profile in Greece. Moreover, 2% of the students in Greece of school population were there is a mistake on the slide where outside inclusive structures. We're not in exclusive structures. That is why, because we have these classes of these extended classes, the European Office considers as inclusion the placement in general classes for 12% of the school time. So we are at a crossroads. We are at a crossroads as a scientific field and in practice. If we say that special education is in the scientific field, so as a scientific field, we are at the crossroads because we try to see how to improve special education on evidence-based practices, but at the same time, we have an identity crisis. That is why we should not hide that. As a practice, special education in the manuals, special education is considered to be specially planned and individualized teaching for people with disability, But in people with disability, we include people with learning difficulties, but that is not the objective of special education. Generally, people with disability. What should be discerned is that people with disability that have special learning need. The US Act is very clear on that. It does not consider as an object of special education people with disability in general, but people with disability, the disability of whom is a cause for low school performance, influences school learning. The approach of special education is that education is an individual, at the same time public good, and it is a social right for everyone. The objective is to have an intervention, educational intervention, to maximize school skills, reading, writing, mathematics, and the operational everyday skills, functional skills. Of course, there are special educational targets that are not set for normal students. Life skills, self-support, speech skills, etc. At these crossroads, there are 2 points of view. The first is to have this continuous of framework to reinforce and improve, and there is the other point of view, this of full inclusion. The objective placement of students with disabilities should be the general class alone. That means abolition of all other institutions, including special schools, inclusion classes, and of course there is a spectrum, a variety of approaches in that, but the approach is that the inclusion classes are frameworks that separate people, not bringing them together. And occasionally we hear this point of view that inclusion classes are like ghettos. They don't have anything to offer. And I need to say that the United Nations Committee that follows the convention, supervises the Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities, in 2016 had a general comment published that tried to reinterpret the framework, and they were very skeptic, even in institutions like co-teaching or parallel support. They were rather tacit in that, and there was no room left for special educators. There was silence, full silence with regard to special educators, meaning that what they mean by full inclusion is that the general teacher, the general educator can do everything. And we have an issue at this crossroads. What is the role of the educator? Well, we have special education teachers. We will have a general inclusion teacher for everything that will have another education, another retraining, which will include this inclusion approach. Because we should say that the committee per se remains also silent with regard and members and people that follow this approach believe that special education is a field that separates people, not bring them together. And it's bad. It's bad because it promotes supposedly a medical model that focuses on deficits. And the same rationale believes that this field should be replaced with studies, disability studies in education, which saw a mix of philosophy, sociology, etc. I have good terms with, I'm in good terms with philosophy and sociology, and it will be a mixture of arts, but minimum focus will be on specific skills that develop education and learning. These are pending issues nowadays, and on which we have the conflict. It's not a question of inclusion per se. It's not the issue of inclusion. We all agree on that. The issue of conflict is on whether we should abolish all frameworks and what should be done in the classes in which people with disabilities will be included, or educational or learning disabilities. I repeat the speaker says. And I need to clarify things. Inclusion versus full inclusion. There are some notional misunderstandings. Inclusion is misunderstood as social inclusion occasionally. For example, most students in Greece are in secondary education. From 12,000 students of special schools, only 4,000 are in primary school students. With the most recent data I have of 2020, and the rest, 8,000 are in secondary education. Most of them get professional training. And occasionally they are part of professional training programs. They try to learn certain professions and practice in this framework. We believe that this promotes social inclusion, even though it is in frameworks that are not part of the general education school. It promotes special education and social inclusion, and we need to say that education is a system. This system does not have a general school alone. We have technical education, we have afternoon schools. Are these schools racist schools, discriminatory schools, or it is an institution that gives a possibility for people that work in the morning to attend evening schools? We have the second chance schools in Greece, and we have private schools per se. Why don't we have a discussion about the private schools, for example? On the other part, aren't they discriminatory schools per se? Why do we have the perception of educational system as a linear one? System that does not mean all parts of the system to be the same, but they have been formed in such a way through history so as to serve social and learning needs. And I need to say that disability in learning, when a disability influences learning, it's not the same thing. It's totally different disabilities that have to do with the architecture of mentality, of notion, uh, totally different diversity. It concerns Roma, refugees, ethnic minorities, etc. I don't say that because I don't want education for Romas, refugees, etc. To the contrary, one of the things I agree with the Commissions of United Nations remarks. Greece offers too few services to other kinds of diversity. This table is the most recent one from a report of OECD published 10 days ago for the inclusion education in Portugal, and shows that Greece is very poor in the services it offered after school to promote language skills. It is ranked last in the OECD table with 15-20% of children receiving this kind of language services, and Portugal in ranked first with these services offered to 20% of students. I go back to inclusion as an evolutionary process. It shows, the table shows that cultural forces are such that we go all the more towards inclusion, and in 10 years, from 2010 to 2019, from 60% that received services in the United States, in the general class, today we have 80%. This is a global process. What's the problem? Mr. Lolitas said at the beginning that we need to understand the two pillars of special education and inclusion. If we see this axis, the horizontal is special education, and without special education, without inclusion, with inclusion. My point of view is in that segment to allow cultural forces to act, to have to focus on both axes. We should not focus only on inclusion and prevent the other axis of special education, especially nowadays, that we have a lot of developments scientifically substantiated, and we can offer upgraded learning and at the same time to have more inclusive approaches with more actions and interaction with general schools, and that is what I believe is a progressive, special, inclusive education. Full inclusion perception has a Big Bang approach. There will be a Big Bang. We will abolish special schools, the inclusion classes. All children will be part of the general class, and at the end, automatically, since the teachers of general education won't be able to do otherwise, will adjust themselves to this system of full inclusion. It reminds it reminds us of a systemic shock suffered by various economies in the planet after the intervention of IMF. Of course, that was the reality of 1950s and 60s. Back then, teachers had not been oriented. Many children were excluded from any kind of education. Even today, I will refer to Italy. Many children that theoretically has implemented the full inclusion model have not enough time or have too few hours in general classes because these children have behavioral issues, and the parents are called to come to the classes and take their children, and under the pressure of other parents, they receive services in medical structures outside school. This is typically a model of full inclusion with a lot of medical influences. Is a medical model full inclusion. Substantially, what is said is what you see. This line. I believe that here we need to have a lot of changes, or a lot of changes will take place, because if special education is a true need, if they need to fill in the gap in reading, writing, mathematics, etc. To improve of the functionality of children, to improve their speech, to improve their social skills, there is a need, it is a true need. Be sure that we will have a private initiative that will cover this need. We already have 1,000 or 1,100 assistants in roles of parallel support hired by families, and they play the role of special educator in school, whereas in a public structure, so they are in a public structure, but they are paid by the parents. This will intensify in the future. When we present the models in teaching and education and training in parallel support, we present these approaches. On this model, well, this covers us in theory, but in practice, in research of 2016 and the one we are running right now, the model implemented is this: one teacher and the assistant is assisting for one or two children. That does not correspond to what supposedly takes place in the United States. One is teaching and the other is assisting more than one children going around the class. So parallel support is a static model, because the special education teacher is assigned to a student alone, and it's not like the model followed in the United States, one for more than one person with disabilities. Usually they are people with long experience. They are in place from September or earlier. That is the main teacher. Usually the assistant teachers or special education teachers come later. The main teacher is the host, and the other is like a guest. And that is the case in Italy as well. Support teachers, because we avoid calling them special education teachers, they are second-class teachers. So there are a lot of issues with inclusion practices. I don't say that we have effective ones. There are models, peer tutoring, where students with normal development assist students with disabilities within the class, and there is some research showing that it has positive effects. But when we transfer an institution from one country to other countries, adjusting the organizational and systemic framework of the other country is of paramount importance, and an institution that demands high cooperation in a framework of low cooperation in Greece, for example, when the door closed, the main teacher was the boss. Classes used to be the paradise of the autonomy of the teacher. In the research we're running right now in this paradise of autonomy, when we have another adult introduced, there is a conflict between the ownership the main teacher wants to have and the active role for which the support teacher was trained. We have a conflict between these two, and of course we have various issues because physical presence in the class is not enough, does not prevail from exclusion, social discrimination, or bullying. I would like to say more, but I think that we have agreed with Jeff Kaufman to talk about 40 minutes. I will just say a couple of things more, and then my colleague will be able to fill in the gaps. By taking a look at the international experience, you can see we can have the matrix test. Morpheus says, will you take the blue pill or the red one? If you take the blue one, you will see everything like a bed of roses. But if you take the red pill, you will see a more complex reality, not always the best. For example, when special schools close with this wild integration at the beginning of 60s, at the end of 60s and beginning of 70s, Italy, where it was a pioneer in special education, became a pariah. It tried to cover the needs of students with serious disabilities. And we talk about a state that experienced in full a welfare state and funded abundantly education and special education. Italian colleagues say that 26.4% of students with disability spend more than 50% of their time for lessons outside the class, and 56.2% spend 20 to 40% of the total of their classes outside the general class. So we satisfy on the one hand full inclusion. There is a gray typical education which is similar to special classes of the United States or resource rooms. And there are a lot of complaints that special education that support teachers are like assistants, and in order to facilitate more students in very strict economic frameworks, they hire less for more students. In Portugal, the second country that introduces itself to the model of full inclusion, you will see that from 2010 to 2018, before the law was voted for, 1,555 students of public special schools were decreased to 984, a decrease of 37%. At the same time, for various reasons, students with disability and special educational needs were increased. And the students of private schools, in general schools, covered that need. And you will see that from all those increases, private schools had an increase of 412.8%, which was the same phenomenon we saw in Italy back in the 1990s until the system made the necessary adjustments. I won't cover everything because I have promised not to. Social inclusion and social justice. I will just tackle this one. In a chapter of a book issued back in 2018, and it is one of the most popular. There are two for explaining the rights of people with disabilities. We talk about proportional equality for people with disability. It is based on Aristotle's train of thought. There are two ways of being unfair: to treat people with equal abilities in training, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, linguistic minorities, or people with deafness, and that if they had a sign interpreter to do well, or people with blindness that have received a braille education can participate in general education. So to treat those people with equal abilities in learning in an unequal way because of stereotype, prejudice at school and at work. But there is another way of fair injustice to treat people with different abilities, learning abilities, and with questioned mental or contested autonomy. For example, people with intellectual disability, or people with mental problems, schizophrenia, etc., in a similar way, what we call sameness. And of course, we must never forget in this second adjustment, we must never forget social protection for people with serious developing health problem, myopathies, conclusive illnesses, etc. What is the main idea behind all these? Social policy should cover all spectrum of disabilities. And there is not one group of disability because we use the same label of disability to be able to represent the rest. There is an issue of representation here. So it's good to have, for political reasons, a label, but diversity starts from the point we introduce the issue of disability. There is a huge spectrum of social learning needs. A lot of people with disabilities like deafness, blindness, etc., can be served well by a legislation against social discrimination. But some others, or most people with chronic diseases, or with no diseases, with mental issues, schizophrenia, depression, and other problems in the spectrum of autism are faced with extreme challenges beyond the legislation that should exist against discrimination. They actually are in need of offset programs in order to get more support, more assistance. That we can call it social justice. And now, how can we revitalize special education? What's new in special education? It has been accused that it is glued on a behavioral model alone. With Jim, we have introduced the perception that has been formed in situ. We have approaches that applied analysis of behavior are okay for people with autism of behavior problems, but when we try to deal with higher educational skills like writing and learning, we see that Vygotsky and cognitivism approaches are very important. What is the criteria that we have? The data and the findings that say what creates or increases learning and social skills in a framework of human dignity. Evidence-based practices offer, in other words, an objective way of assessing educational philosophies. We might think that we have the best philosophy available, but we need research in order to have all the findings to see what works and what doesn't. This is the collaborative strategic reading model. And here we have another intervention from Karen Harris and Steve Graham and their team in self-regulation strategy development model of writing, which is very important on how we intervene in writing. This is a big chapter on how we can revitalize special education evidence-based. So I think that I exceeded my time. I will stop here for the next speaker. Thank you, Mr. Anastasiou. I was very I found his presentation extremely interesting. I jotted down a lot of things. It's true that in 1 hour we are not able to analyze, not even present all these issues he touched upon, because he touched upon everything with regard to special education, the problems faced by all of us. The most important issue, nevertheless, and I totally agree, is the two axes that he presented. At the two ages, we have yes or no special education and yes or no inclusion. And as you correctly said, we cannot have neither. We should have both. This very moment, we cannot isolate either. And when I was asked from a newspaper, I had told them that the problem is not in special education and training. What it needs, we know. The issue is if general education can have an inclusive approach the way it was introduced in Italy or Portugal. And in a forum of the Observatory for People with Disabilities, and we had representatives from Italy and Portugal presenting these models, myself and others said that if there is a assessment of what was implemented, did this model work properly or not? Mr. Anastasiou was quite thorough. What he said about the United States, that there is an approach, that doesn't mean that all disabilities need special education. In-house teaching was offered by support teachers. That changed. In-house teaching is offered by a special educator after an opinion of the respective committee for people with disability. And of course there are other pending issues. Parallel support is also a big chapter. The speaker touched upon certain issues with parallel support. we cannot change roles in the classrooms. For example, a support teacher and the host teacher to switch, because not all of general teachers have educated. Support teachers were also introduced in the private sector. I think that the presentation was exceptional, and hopefully we will have the details of all of it, because we know that in an hour it's not possible to be able to analyze everything. And now we will give the floor to Mr. Kaufman. Dr. Kaufman, you've got the floor.
Okay, thank you. First, I want to thank the president of the Federation and other people for inviting me to do this. I consider it a great honor, and I will try to speak slowly and distinctly so that the interpretation is not difficult. I don't speak Greek and I don't speak English terribly well, but I will do the best I can. Regarding this patch on the side of my head, I had skin surgery Monday, and I look considerably better than I did midweek because my eye was black and swollen, but I'm now pretty much fully recovered. I want to thank Dimitris Anastasio also for his comments. I first met him 14 years ago at a conference in Turkey, and we immediately became friends, and he has become a wonderful, valued colleague with whom I've done some work, and I appreciate him very much, and want to state that I agree with what he said. One of the things that's so difficult about education or any other field is deciding how much to separate what a person says from what we call them. Now, I would consider Dimitris a very smart person. That's because he says a lot of very smart things. And I don't have any recollection of him saying something I thought was stupid. And one of the things that I want to make clear at the beginning of my presentation is that I don't have any questions about the motives of the people with whom I disagree. I think we're all searching for the same thing. We would like the same thing. We would like to have education that's better for all children. The question is, how do we get it? What's the best way of going about getting better education for all kids? So I'm not attributing any evil motives to people whose statements I disagree with. I think everyone has good intentions. The question is, how do we separate ideas from people so that we can talk about them. So I know that I will be criticized as attacking people, but I don't mean to attack any person. I will attack ideas that I think do not make sense. And I will admit this, they don't make sense to me. That doesn't mean that they don't make sense to anyone. And I realize that some of what I say may not make sense to other people. But I hope that those listening to me won't consider me a stupid person because they believe that something I said is stupid. I hope that most of what comes out of my mouth makes sense. But I realize sometimes people disagree. I will just try to say as clearly as I can what I believe, what I think. And some people will disagree with that. But here's one thing I think is that the way to kill public education is to insist on full inclusion. That is, that there are no exceptions. All children are to be educated in regular public school classes. Now, people may not intend to kill education, to kill public education, but that doesn't mean that they will not. Just because they do not intend to does not mean that the consequences of their actions will be to kill public education. Now, why do I think full inclusion taken to the extreme will kill public education? The reason I think that is that it will make teaching so hard, so difficult, so impossible for general education teachers that competent teachers will not want to do it. They will just say, no, I can't. Now, the way to make education harder for people is to increase the diversity of the learning that's involved. And I hope that in the course of my comments, I can make the distinction clear between learning diversity and diversity of other types. So when public school teachers are faced with a task, the task is not made harder by different colors of kids or different genders or different gender identities. Much of the diversity that we can find in children doesn't involve what they know and what they need to learn. But the more diverse the group is in what they know and what they need to learn, the harder it is. And the more children you have in a class whose learning diversity is very great, the harder it is to teach. So if you want to make the job of teaching in primary schools, in public education, impossible, the way to do that, the way to make it impossible, is to make the group so diverse that no reasonable person can do it. Even the best teachers are not going to be able to do it. And all teachers are not the best. I mean, when you think about teaching in the public schools, you have to think about what the typical teacher can do, not just the best. If you took the top 10% of teachers, well, yeah, they can do things that the bottom 10% can't, probably. And well, a lot of things that we say about education just don't make sense to me. Like, are some teachers better than others? I think so. Do we have a way of measuring that? It's very difficult. But some teachers are better than others. I think that we can depend on, regardless of how we measure how good they are. Now, I have had the great privilege of being a teacher myself in special ed, in institutional classes, in public school classes, and I've been a general education teacher. Of course, this was years ago, but I also can say that I had the privilege of being married for 35 years to very good special ed teachers. I was married for 25 years to an outstanding teacher of young children with intellectual disabilities. She died 10 years ago. I now have the privilege of being married to another very fine teacher whom I have observed in classes in schools. She's the best teacher I've ever seen. Her name is Jean Marie Badar. And it's just wonderful to see her working with kids and adults. I'm getting off track here, but I think one thing that will happen if inclusion is pushed to the limits is that public schools will pretty much disappear and private schools will take over, particularly for children with more severe disabilities. And I think Dimitris's presentation suggested that. So anyway, I have edited a book that will be coming out later this year on inclusion, and we might show that first slide. This book is now being typeset. That's the cover. And then the next slide shows some things from the preface, in which I try to explain that this book is about revitalizing special education, not general education, but special education, so that it becomes more obviously a reliable help to children with disabilities. It's not that it's not helpful now, but we want to make it more helpful. And this is going to require a second revolution in what we think about special ed, what it means, what it is, what it does. And if it is to become consistently those things, then it needs examination, including self-appraisal. And one of the things that I think I try to make clear is special education is not above criticism. It certainly can be criticized. It needs improvement. So does general education, or education in general needs improvement. So it needs some self-appraisal, some criticism. It's just that the criticism of it needs to be coherent, logical, based in evidence that we can marshal. So, no, I would not say don't criticize special education, but I would say make sure that your criticism makes sense, that it is something that we can deal with in the real world. Now, special education has been under attack as an idea for quite a long time. And at the end of the presentation here, we'll show a slide with my email address. So you can email me to obtain some work that I am doing, work that's in press, work that other people are doing. And I'll be happy to share anything I can with people who send a request. My colleague, Dan Hallahan, and his wife, Paige Pullen, another colleague of mine, have an article coming out in the Journal of Disability Policy Studies. And in that paper, we talk about special ed coming to terms with what we call a new normal. And some of the ideas that people are putting forward as important are really destructive of special education. And so we talk about that. Now, the next slide, if we can see the next slide, it shows the table of contents for this book. You saw the cover before. And so you might note some of these chapters. I'm going to talk a little bit about chapter 1 and how we've gotten to the point where special education is seen in a negative light. So the next slide shows some of the things I talk about in chapter 1. And it's certainly impossible for me to talk about the entire chapter. It's too long and too complicated to try to present. So in the next hour or so, I want to talk about these 7 things. I think there's 7 of them. Yes. And these are things that I think help explain how we got to the point we are right now, where special education is seen by some people as undesirable, people wanting to get away with it, do away with it, to get rid of special education. So I'll talk a bit about this first one, confusing must and may. So by must, I mean, we just have to do it. If we want to have special education, we have to have this. That's a must. The may is, well, we could do it this way, we could do it that way. So there are some choices there, but if you're going to have special education, then you must do certain things. And I want to mention something here that was published almost 30 years ago, 28 years ago. This was published by Dorothy Lipsky and Alan Gartner in Harvard Educational Review. So it was published by Harvard University. Let me read what they said. Here is a quotation from that article. Special education plays a sorting role, both for those consigned to it and for those students who must remain in general education. It limits expectations of the former, that is, it limits expectations of exceptional children, and gnarls the attitudes of the latter, that is, kids in general education. Thus, the system of special education and the attitudes towards disability that undergird it have harmful consequences for both those labeled disabled and those not. That's the end of their statement. And they apparently, Lipsky and Gartner failed to understand, and the reviewers and the editor also failed to understand, that all education requires sorting and labeling. Is you have to say this one, not that one. Special education has to say this one, not that one, about a lot of things. So you have to sort. There's no way you can have education without sorting students who know from students who don't know certain things, or students who are ready or not ready for the next step in education. And in order to do that sorting, we have to have a word or a label for the child who does or the child who does not have the particular skill in question. So, yeah, we may have different labels. We may sort in different ways, but sorting and labeling cannot be avoided. So Lipsky and Gartner also did not seem to understand properly the foundations of special education. What are those assumptions about special ed and about exceptionality, or most of the time we're talking about disability, not giftedness. But theirs is only one example of statements about special education that just do not make sense. And the reason they don't make sense is they're confusing must and may. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is accepting illogic and imprecise language. And we could go into a lot of things here, but one thing that a lot of people complain about is norms. And the fact is that if you measure something, you get a norm. I don't think you can measure anything without getting a distribution of scores or values, a statistical distribution. So people who complain about norms or averages or normality are just not recognizing the fact that when you measure, you get a norm, you get an average, you get a statistical distribution. And that statistical distribution has certain features every single time. There are no exceptions. When you measure something, you get a range of scores. You get an average, which can be described as the mean or the median or the mode. That distribution will have certain features that we call kurtosis. Now, of course, there are people who say, well, let's not measure. Measurement is an evil thing. Let's get away from measurement. Well, then there's the question of, well, how do you decide things? And of course, there are those people who will say, well, I just decided. Well, how did you make that decision? Well, I just know. Well, how did you know? So, yes, measurement has its problems. It has its difficulties. But if you don't measure, you're stuck with, I don't know, some sort of subjective judgment, or somebody just saying, well, I think so. It's just my opinion that, well, okay, if you want to go that route, but science demands measurement. So there are other illogical things, imprecise things that people say, that people write, and you wonder, how did they come up with this? Then there's the matter of responding to all diversities in the same way. And of course, some people will claim that disability is just like race or gender or other diversities. Well, in some ways it is, in some ways it isn't. I mean, disability is a certain kind of diversity. It might be like and unlike other forms of diversity, depending on what we're talking about. But the thing we're talking about here is education, not something else. So the way you respond to diversity depends on what you're trying to do. And some disabilities are not really important at all in education, or, you know, they can be easily accommodated. Kid in a wheelchair who can't walk, well, yeah, has a disability, but that disability doesn't have anything to do with the instruction of that person. It has something to do with accessibility. But when it comes to instruction, we don't care. Is a kid in a wheelchair? Doesn't matter. Can walk? Doesn't matter. Has asthma? not really important for teaching. But some disabilities, depending on the child's intellectual capability, history of learning, well, yeah, those things are really important. And they're not like other diversities. But let me read you something here, written by a guy named Roger Slee. Now, Roger Slee is, I would say, a pretty bright guy about a lot of things, but I don't think Roger understands teaching and learning. And one of the reasons I think that is he talks about all, meaning all, and no exceptions, and lumping other diversities in with disabilities, which to me doesn't make sense if you're talking about teaching, if you're talking about education. Here's something that Roger wrote in 2018. And he states, and by all, they really do mean all. And he goes on to give some examples. And I'll read what he says in this 2018 book, which to me just doesn't make sense. He says, the child who can't see, the child whose family has been displaced by war and doesn't speak the school's home language, the child who has difficulty with mobility, the child who doesn't hear, the child whose behavior is very different or difficult, the child who will be absent for periods of time because of chronic illness or is from an itinerant family, or the child who can't communicate in ways that most other children do. This is an abbreviated list for all children. I think, Roger, really? Blind? Deaf? Never mind, Roger, that displacement by war and failure to speak the school's home language are not disabilities? Why do you lump all these together? I want to ask Roger. Why are they all the same? They are not all the same for teaching. If you're serious about teaching. But Roger says, well, this is the only way we can have a really democratic society, is if we don't have general ed and special ed, we just have education. That seems to me, personally, the most regressive, silly idea, certain to kill public education. You can't be serious, I want to say. And then there's, so Roger says, yeah, all means all. And we run into this a lot in the inclusion literature. All means all. There are no exceptions. It's the kind of thing where you make an absolute rule. There are no exceptions. And some people want to make that, they want to make that kind of absolute rule for things like abortion. You just never, ever do it. Can't be done. And some people say, well, it depends. Mostly scientists have to say, Well, it depends. Can you fly? Well, it depends. I mean, if you're in an airplane, yes, you can fly. But can you fly like Superman? Um, Probably not. It's not going to happen. But then there are people who use all disingenuously. That is, all doesn't really mean all. And I'll give you an example. This example came to me from Mike Gerber. Mike Gerber is now retired from the University of California at Santa Barbara. And he's a former student of mine. And he went to a presentation by a guy who died recently, the late Robert Slavin, who's known as Bob Slavin. And Bob has a program called Success for All. So he was giving this presentation, and Mike was in the audience. And Mike said, Bob, when you say all, do you really mean all? And Mike says, I stress that final all to be clear, thinking he might back away a bit from hyperbole. And Bob says, yes. And Mike paused and said, really? All? As if maybe he'd been too subtle. And Bob paused and said, well, except the emotionally disturbed and the truly mentally retarded. So there are people who say all and don't really mean it. They can't. I mean, if they say all, and by all, I mean all, each and every, no exceptions, you want to say, what world do you live in anyway? I mean, do you know disability? Do you know teaching? What makes you think that an individual with very serious intellectual disability and persistent self-destructive behavior, like biting himself or slapping her head, what makes you think that that kid belongs in a general education class? But there are some people like Roger Slee, Wayne Saylor, who say, yeah, all means all. And they don't admit any exceptions. Maybe if they were pushed hard, confronted by reality, they would say there are exceptions, but I don't know. And then there's this D, spurning science. And lots of people nowadays are disenchanted with science, and they distrust it and deny it, or think it's misleading. Just this morning in the New York Times, I read an article about a guy who he's a medical doctor, but he's spreading misinformation about COVID-19. So, yeah, I guess people assume that the scientific majority don't know what they're talking about. or they think that some physician or scientist who disagrees with the majority, that they somehow have a handle on reality that other people don't recognize. But that's not typically true. We see this kind of denialism in cases of climate change, vaccination, various other things that I won't go into. And we see it sometimes in education itself. Now, I want to read you a little statement published back in 2004. That's what, 18 years ago, by a woman who got her degree at the University of Virginia. Her name was Debbie Nuttycombe then. It's now Debbie Gallagher. And she edited a book about challenging what she called orthodoxy in special education. So she wrote, and I'm quoting, "Those who question the utility of this," she was referring to enlightenment versions of scientific research, "maintain that such an approach to teacher preparation actually precludes sound teaching practice." In other words, Enlightenment science will make it impossible. If you believe in research in the Enlightenment tradition, that will make it impossible for you to teach. I don't doubt her intentions. I think her intentions were good. Is trying to find the best way to do things, the best way to teach effectively. But her idea, well, I would say is pre-Enlightenment thinking, maybe medieval thinking. Now, I want to read you something recently accepted for publication in the Journal of Disability Policy Studies. This is an article by Doug Fuchs and a couple of students. So it's Fuchs et al. And we might show that slide, I think, for the Fuchs et al. In press, if we have that. Then let's go to the next slide. Yeah, this one. So here you have the authors, the title, and the journal in which this article is going to be published, the Journal of Disability Policy Studies. Michael Uden, by the way, was a former, I think, former director of special education programs, who said some things that Fuchs et al. Thought, I wonder if that's true. And Uden's claim was that the more time students with disabilities spend in general classrooms, the better they do academically. And Fuchs et al. Show why that is not true. It is a lie. And I want to read a little bit from the concluding section of their paper. And so I'm reading now from this article. In explaining his support of full inclusion to parents, advocates, educators, and others in terms of general education's high expectations and rigorous standards, Michael Uden rarely, if ever, mentioned the value of special education, whereas he touted unproven innovations like universal design for learning and questionably promising reforms like response to intervention. He never spoke of large-scale studies reporting the benefits of special education. And here they cite a couple. And I continue with the quote. Nor did he mention the more numerous experiments like Lynn Fuchs et al., documenting the superiority of intensive instruction for many students with disabilities over general instruction. To ignore such evidence and their implications for practice is to ignore science. It is to pretend, in fact, in the face of evidence indicating otherwise, that there is but one solution to educating all students with disabilities, namely placing them in general education classrooms. And they go on to talk about how important it is to have imagination in special ed and education in general. We have to be able to imagine things being better. But then they say this, and I'm quoting again from Fuchs et al. What we cannot imagine is that general classrooms will become capable of teaching all students with disabilities. We cannot imagine this because we know it to be unrealistic and dangerously naive. Many students with disabilities need something different than general classroom instruction. And finally, they say this, and again, I quote Fuchs et al. Changes are necessary to strengthen the education of many students with and without disabilities. First on any must change list, we believe, is that education leaders from state house to schoolhouse speak truth to stakeholders. Truth telling requires recognizing and accepting the inherent complexities of many issues and problems, especially those that matter most, and that these almost always require different solutions for different children and youth. So I won't go further, but there's just a lot of science denial. And then I want to mention, if we can go back to the previous slide, confusing attribute and person. And this is very difficult. In talking about disabilities, people have often urged us to use what's called person first language. So person first language would say, no, 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 you don't talk about a behavior disordered child. You talk about a child with behavior disorders. So you put the child first, person with. Well, we have the same problem in talking about revising or revitalizing special education and criticism of it. So do we say a person who promotes inclusionary education, or do we say an inclusionary person or an inclusionista or some other term? How do we separate person from statement? That's one that mystifies me. It's very difficult to separate person from statement or person from position, but I suppose we have to do that. And finally, I want to talk about oh no, I'm sorry. The sixth one there is putting the worst possible face on special education. Like, how do we do that? Well, one of the ways that people criticize special education is to say, well, it's segregation, it's discrimination, it's somehow unacceptable if it involves any separation from the general education. And so the worst face you can put on special ed is that it's horrible. It's separation, it's discrimination, it's labeling, it's all these evil things that we don't like. And it's separating kids and just pretending to help them, but it's not really helping them. It's just all pretense. There are people who criticize special ed as these terrible things, mistreating people. So people don't want to portray special ed as something helpful. Rather than something helpful, I think it's sort of like giving people fake medicine or doing surgery that's unnecessary. Let me give you one example here of putting a bad face on education. There was an article published not long ago, I think 2020, 2 years ago, by Mike Waymeyer and colleagues at the University of Kansas. And this was an article published in a journal about the education of individuals with severe disabilities. And it was in a special issue about how we oppress kids with disabilities by keeping them in special classes and so on. The question was, why are more students with severe disabilities not included in special ed? Well, my wife and Jason Travers and I wrote about that in that special issue of the journal. But Waymeyer et al. Talked about how discrimination continues and people with severe disabilities are not included in general education. And they said, among other things, that there was only a 9.3% 1.39% increase in inclusion in general education. Well, yes, in one sense, that's true, 9.39% increase. But the increase was from 7.11% to 16.50%. So it was more than doubling. In fact, it was an increase of 232%. Looked at a different way. Like when you say a percentage increase, well, what if it was from 1% to 5%? That's a five-fold increase. True is only 4% from 1 to 5. But if you looked at it as a percentage of increase, it was 5 times. So going from 7.11 to 16.50, well, 2.32 times 7.11 equals 16.495. So yes, you can portray it as a small increase, but actually it was a whopping increase. So people are prone to downplay progress. And last I want to...
Και τέλος θέλω να αναφέρω την παρερμήνευση αυτού που ονομάζουμε ενός ελάχιστα περιοριστικού περιβάλλοντος. Λοιπόν,
the United States law says that children must be placed in the least restrictive environment, or LRE, and the full inclusion advocates maintain that the least restrictive environment for all children is a regular public school classroom. So there is no place for special classes or special schools or anything other than just regular class placement. That is an extreme sort of position. And then some people try to play a cognitive trick, what I consider a cognitive trick, by saying, oh, no, we're not talking about placing the body in general education necessarily. What we're talking about is equity, so that everybody gets what's right for them. The trick here is that what they're really saying is, well, yes, you can have appropriate instruction, but you have to do it here. So the long story short is that place trumps instruction. And my wife and I have recently written about how the primary objective is instruction, not place. Instruction comes first, appropriate instruction, then you decide place. But that has fallen into disfavor with people like Roger Slee and Wayne Saylor, who say, well, no, you get the body in the right place first, and then you worry about appropriate instruction. And they'll actually say, well, yeah, we're worried about appropriate instruction as long as you do it here. So really, it is a devious way of saying, no, you can't have special ed if it's outside the general education classroom. And then even in general ed, can you have it? Well, Yeah, I go into this in my chapter 1, 2 in my book. And if we could see the next slide. Um, let's see, the next one is, yeah. So this book is coming out, and if you want to find out about it, you can go to Emerald Group, should be group, emeraldgrouppublishing.com books, and you should be able to find this book on that site. And then the next slide, I think, is my email address. So, or maybe it didn't come through. My email address is my initials, JMK, number 9, letter T. So it's JMK9T at Virginia, spelled out VIRGINIA.edu. So it's JMK9T at Virginia.edu. So if you want to email me to comment on what I've said or ask for any publications that I mentioned or others that you know about, I'm very willing to do that and to send you what I can. And I am now ready to try to answer questions, and maybe Dr. Anastasio will be able to answer some that I can't.
Και βέβαια πάντα υπάρχει και πιθανότητα να μην μπορώ να απαντήσω κάποια πράγματα. Ευχαριστούμε.
Would like to thank the speaker, Mr. Kaufman, because we are running late, even though I have jotted down a lot of things that you have mentioned. I just say that your presentation has shown us very clearly why he is considered an innovative author and researcher. The way we deal with diversity depends on what we want to do is very important. And for example, a student with mobility issues or not teaching is important than accessibility has also to do with paragraph 2 of law 39, which is paragraph focusing on parallel support. And in substance, there is no distinction on that. In other words, while it says that the success of parallel support it's self-abolition, there is no differentiation.
Από την αρχή μέχρι το τέλος της σχολικής
sensory disabilities that should be taken into consideration from start. So students that want this assistant should have it constantly until they finish their education. Μπορείτε παρακαλώ...
γρήγορα. Δεν ξέρω, επειδή δεν γράφουν που απευθύνουν.
Well, I don't... we have some questions, nevertheless.
Λοιπόν, η πρώτη ερώτηση.
Question number 1 says, how students with special needs can have the education they want, since the Ministry of Education does not correspond to its duties. I don't know who could answer this question, probably Mr. Anastasiou, because it concerns Greece. I have nothing to say to us. I think this is a question of the teachers' movement. Yes, the president of DOE probably would like to say, let's group the questions and then let's have a small comment by the speakers. Let's see. Okay. Problems that have to do with students in secondary education. That is linked to the next question. When we have a burden in education, in general education, we need to have a support teacher to support Mr. Anastasiou. For secondary education, the problems have been underlined. In American reality, Mastro Pieri at Cracks had quality studies in 2005-2008, if I remember well, which was a synthesis of the different approaches, and John Lloyd with Margaret Weiss have shown that generally in secondary education it's easy to implement parallel support in kindergarten. It's much easier because the academic part is of less importance. So we can focus on social skills mainly and things to have a good outcome. The more we get into academic issues and the gaps between children increase, you can see a child in the secondary, in the 11th grade, that can not read well, or can read at the pace of a secondary of second grade student, or does not know maths well. We understand that if this child it is at a structure which is of co-teaching, it's difficult to be part of the general program. Nevertheless, these students do exist. There is also the pressure of the curriculum. When students prepare for the Panhellenic exams, with an exam, your academic future is based upon that. If you will continue to university, you understand if the teacher who will choose to focus on children with disabilities, he will have to take time from elsewhere, because time is specific and there are competitive values and expectations, aspirations, and interests. The support teacher can assist, but he cannot do miracles. We also have the phenomenon, the support teacher to become just an assistant and not a special education teacher, to be less teacher not to do what he is taught to do, but substantially, in a way, to do a support lesson, and this is due to the gaps in learning or behavioral problems, especially externalizing behavior problems can create an overall problem. And we have a survey showing that in classes, when we have children, that aggressive behavior changes the whole climate, that has consequences on or impact on the other children. This is something we cannot oversee in a romantic way. That is for co-teaching. It is very difficult, especially in our countries and under these circumstances. Unfortunately, the speaker, we cannot. Co-teaching can help students with learning problems improve. What changes can we have in Greece to have co-teaching more successful? What do you believe on co-teaching? Knowing the problems that parents have when they have a child with autism, but before you answer these, there is one for me that concerns something which concerns the law, and the one who asked the teacher the question does not agree with what I have said, because he believes that cooperation is needed in special education. We need all of us to cooperate and upgrade the models in order to promote co-teaching. Since it is addressed to me, I did not make any comment or a negative one. I just mentioned the law, and I talked about the structural problem of switching roles. Co-teaching, co-programming can happen, but it is not provided by law very thoroughly. That was not a negative comment on my part, but the description of the law as it is in Greece. These are structural issues that derive from the law. It has nothing to do with cooperation, co-teaching, or curricula. Mr. Anastasiou, have you got anything to add with regard to previous questions? I need to be clear. I believe that parallel support co-teaching is part of special education. We might not have seen the best research results, but the research results in this kind of surveys find the average, compare with something else, and I don't exclude, and I have heard by parents, especially parents with students with autism. Okay, so we heard from these parents with children with autism to be quite pleased, because children had acquired some social skills within the general classroom. I am not unidimensional with regard to general education. It can help certain children. There is a problem with the institutional framework. Generally speaking, the 6 models that educators are taught of Merlin, Fred, and others substantially talk about switching. Not one model should be followed alone. In the same class, we can implement all models, and we need to have to be flexible in order to pass from one model to the next, depending on the needs of the classroom. What else we see is that this delayed that parallel support teachers come late during the year in the class, yes, that makes them guests. If the class has already started and they get in after a couple of months, they play the role of a guest. Co-teachers or support teachers in 11th grade or 9th grade have the knowledge that the maths teacher has. Can he have or she has all the knowledge necessary to support students? There are some limits. And parallel support, co-teaching, as every institution has its own limits. Well, if we have revised or if we have cross-checked the surveys. Well, there are so many co-founding factors in research. There are schemes, cooperation between students that have typical skills, abilities, and learning difficulties students that operate much better. And we have various models, polls, which has a good effect size and impact on reading and on maths, basic maths. There are other models of co-teaching that have not been implemented in Greece. The political issue is that inclusion has become a political social issue that does not allow Greek reality to study how we can improve these models. That goes for both special schools. How can special schools become better? How inclusion classes can become better? How can we have early intervention better? How can we have parallel support and differentiate it institutionally? Many parents believe that we have 101,000 students that receive special education in all its forms. There are schools that 1/3 of the students that have been diagnosed with disabilities from Kedasi receive this special education. There is no social system this very moment, nowhere in the world that could say that all students can be part of general classes and each of them will have a teacher. Well, it was assumed as such in the past. Now we have 13,000 support teachers, but that they cannot cover everyone. And how long do they last? Okay, that is what I wanted to say. I'll try to group the next questions. They are questions: what are the result from full inclusion internationally? When we abolish special frameworks, will it cover the needs of general education? What are the percentages of inclusion models? That also goes to the Greek speaker. In countries when we have full inclusion, are there any results that show the success? Mr. Kaufman, all these countries that implement full inclusion, what are the scientific data they are based on? This is a group of questions.
Might answer that. Oh,
Yeah, if you like, you can start.
I don't think we have a lot of data. The information that we do have suggests that special education is helpful. We do have some evidence that suggests that people are lying about inclusion, about what laws require and what is feasible and what can be done. Gary Hornby, who is retired now from the University of Plymouth in the UK, he and I have an article in which we talk about arguing with zombies. And the zombies are ideas that should have died for lack of evidence, but they didn't. And so there are various untrue statements about the benefits of inclusion. Some countries that claim to have implemented full inclusion have not found it very successful. And I think the paper that Dimitris and I and Santo Di Nuovo published suggests that. So people are not always being truthful and forthcoming about the limits of inclusion. One thing I might have failed to mention, and I think Mr. Anastasio did, is that we are not opposed to the idea of inclusion of students with disabilities in general education. What we are opposed to is the idea that there are no limits that all students with disabilities should be included, that this idea of full inclusion is somehow rational and justifiable. It is not. But at the same time, we want to make clear that we are not opposed to all inclusion. It goes back to one of those problems in any philosophy or ideology, and that is absolute versus a judgment call. And what we find unacceptable is the idea that no judgment is required, that we have only one place, and that is general education. And people should not be allowed to make their judgments or decisions. But of course, then we get into the matter of who should be allowed to make the judgment and on what basis. And there will always be differences of opinion about that, I guess, just as there will always be differences of opinion about the absolute. It's like if you say, no, absolutely no abortion, then there are going to be people who disagree with it. If you say, well, it depends. Some abortions, for some reasons, at some levels, are okay. Well, then you're caught with the question of who should be allowed to make the judgment and how did they make it? And you'll always have second guessers who come along and say, oh, well, that was wrong. Well, the fact is that the people who made the judgment were using their best judgment. But there will always be people who disagree. It just seems to be part of the issue. I don't know if Dimitris wants to make any additional statements.
I would like to do. Στα προβλήματα της αποτελεσματικότητας.
As regards efficiency in inclusion in special education, there are many methodological difficulties. In the research that was mentioned by Fuchs, which is in press now, hasn't been published yet, shows, however, that up to a certain point, in some states, it might be beneficial. For example, more students within a classroom might be beneficial, but up to a certain point, because after this point, this positive benefit decelerates, and in some states it might be negative. Regarding revitalizing special education, the book, the team by Paul Morgan, there were 3 authors, I do not remember all of them. Paul Morgan was one among them. This shows that rather the first thematic in this publication was to take students with disabilities in special school and compare them against those in general schools. Methodologically wise, this is a bad comparison because the students that are in special schools have been pre-selected, and there is always a selection bias. They have been selected because they have specific characteristics. So if we take students from general schools in the spectrum of autism, for example, or some that are in special schools. Now the discussion is not on special schools about for autism, but nevertheless we take these kind of students within parallel support or in general education, and if we compare them, it is self-evident what we're going to find. These students have been selected with many social characteristics. In order to succeed, the parallel support